Well, Blood of Paradise and Philoctetes both center around three characters. And Philoctetes is a story of the Trojan War, and the three people are Odysseus, Neoptolemus, who's the son of Achilles, and Philoctetes, a warrior that the Greeks abandoned 10 years before. The story starts in the 10th year of the Trojan War. Achilles has been slain. You're in the middle of the first quagmire that we know of in history, and the Greeks are trying to figure out how they're going to get their way out of this. So they go to the soothsayers and say, you know, what have we done wrong? And the soothsayers say, well, you're never going to win this war without the bow of Heracles. And it just turns out that the bow of Heracles is in the possession of Philoctetes. They abandoned him 10 years earlier when they were on their way to Troy, and they decamped at a desert island, and Philoctetes got bitten by a poisonous snake. And the pain was so fierce, and the wound had such a stench to it because of the venom, that the Greeks couldn't make their offerings to the gods. So the leaders got together and said, what are we going to do? And Odysseus, the cleverest of the Greeks, said, well, let's just leave him here. So one morning, they just all get in their boats and leave him alone. And for 10 years, he's been alone, by himself, with nothing but this bow to feed himself and to take care of himself. Well, now the Greeks realize they've got to go back and get him. But of course, he's had 10 years to build up a hatred and a contempt for everybody in the Greek camp. So Odysseus decides, well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to bring this young guy that he didn't even know. I mean, he was a child at the time, you know, that 10 years ago, so he's not going to hold anything against Neoptolemus. And we'll see how that goes. Now, Neoptolemus, being a young warrior, you know, believes in heroic virtues and thinks that, well, we can appeal to Philoctetes as a warrior, you know, appeal to his honor. And Odysseus says, man, you just don't get it. You know, this isn't going to work. We're going to have to lie to him. And this is the lie you're going to tell. Now, in essence, that means Odysseus corrupts Neoptolemus. But it works. Neoptolemus manages to re-enlist Philoctetes into the cause against Troy. And he ultimately comes back, and they do defeat Troy. But it has an odd little twist at the end. It's the corrupted Neoptolemus who ends up bringing a curse down on all the Greeks, because he's the one who goes into King Priam's personal quarters and slays him at his altar. And this the gods consider unforgivable. And because of that, all of the Greek leaders except Odysseus die either on their way back to Greece or once they get home. For example, you know, Agamemnon is killed by his wife, Electra. So, Clytemnestra. One does get confused with these. He gets killed by Clytemnestra. So, I just found that fascinating. The whole notion that this small corruption could lead to this curse befalling an entire people. Fascinated me. And also just that little moral symmetry among those three characters. You know, the corrupting, you know, elder, the younger man who wants to believe in honor but then realizes that, well, there's something important we have to do, so maybe there's something I need to learn, and that every now and then you got to cut a few corners morally, you know, just to get the job done. And that, what does that lead to? And it leads to, you know, a moral problem that is so large that none of them can solve it. And that was basically what, you know, that was the theme I wanted to follow in this book.
So which character would you say Jude is, the point of view character?
Jude is definitely Neoptolemus. He's the young warrior who still has a sense of warrior virtues, but is susceptible to being compromised by the corrupt elder, who in the book is Bill Malvasio, his dad's best friend.
In Blood of Paradise, how do the themes of corruption and ambition play out? What is the storyline?
Well, again, getting back to that corruption, that Jude, what happens is that you have the corrupt. I'm trying to think of how to start this, because I've realized that when the book begins, Jude is a bodyguard in El Salvador. And he's been doing that for a couple of years. But 10 years earlier, he'd watched his father become disgraced in a corruption scandal that involved Bill Malvasio, his best friend, and Phil Strock, a third cop. They were all cops in Chicago. They were basically robbing drug dealers, and they were caught at it. And this became a huge family scandal, and then became a tragedy when Jude's dad died suddenly. And whether it was a boating accident or suicide, nobody was ever able to tell. Well, Jude, to just sort of escape the taint of this, leaves high school, joins the military, and gets stationed down in Central America. And he falls in love with the place. He builds bridges and digs wells and basically feels like he's doing a good thing for people. But after 2 tours, he's a little restless. He's in his mid-20s, and he gets recruited to be a bodyguard. And he thinks, this sounds interesting. I think I'd be up for this. So he agrees to do that. And it's while he's working as a bodyguard that suddenly this call comes from out of the blue. And it's his dad's old best friend, Bill Malvasio, who says, you know, I'll bet you never really got the whole story about what happened. And if you'd like to know it, I'd be happy to tell you. And because Jude's never had closure on this, and because these were men he always looked up to, but then felt betrayed by, he can't help but at least hear this guy out. And when he does, he discovers a man who's contrite, who feels regretful for everything that happened, and is clearly wounded and has suffered because of what has happened. So Jude finds that has probably misread this whole situation. And then Malvasio makes a request. He says, by the way, there's this, the third member of our little trio, Phil Strzok, he's falling on hard times. And I've got work down here for him, but he'll never take it from me. But he might listen to you, and if you go back and find him, I've got a job for him here, but, don't mention my name. Say it's a friend of yours that got it or whatever, and maybe it'll all work out great for everybody. And Jude, because he still wants to, in some way, convince himself that he can measure up to these men, but not like his father, get sucked in. He says, okay, I'll do this, but this is all I'm going to do. But of course, just like the curse in Philoctetes, once the corruption starts, where does it stop? And that's unfortunately is what Jude has to learn.
You are a New York Times notable author, and this is not your first book. You choose to set the latest book in El Salvador. Why?
I met someone from El Salvador, and she told me a story that was so compelling, I just felt drawn into this country. Her dad had been a colonel in the military, who'd been part of a leftist coup in 1960, and got sent to Germany to keep him out of trouble. But when he came back, it was in time for what they called the Soccer War in 1969, and it was nothing but a way for the Salvadoran military to line its own pockets. And he was so disgusted by the corruption, he left the military, which you don't do in El Salvador. Because your first loyalty is to your fellow officers in your graduating class, next to the military in general, then to the oligarchy, and only secondarily or thirdly to the country or to the people. And he turned his back on all that, and then tried to forge his own business, for his family, and just trying to keep his nose clean. But in 1980, when the repression was really circling out of control, he was walking outside with his wife, and a scooter started coming down the street the wrong way. And just as he was pushing his wife behind him with one hand and reaching for his pistol with the other, the guy riding behind on the scooter took out a pistol of his own and with one shot took him out, shot him through the heart. So they were professional assassins, probably military. Nobody ever found out for sure. But that story just went right through me, and I thought, I want to know more about this. And my friend said, well, why don't you come down, meet my family and my friends, and I'll show you around. And the country just spoke to me in a way that I thought, I really got to talk about this place.
In the book's concluding essay, you challenged the U.S. claim to victory in El Salvador, calling it an act that has left its civilians decimated. Do you equate Americans' involvement there to the Iraqi war?
I don't equate El Salvador with Iraq, but the reason that I have analogized them is because neoconservatives have done that since the mid-90s. And in particular, Dick Cheney, Don Rumsfeld, and Paul Wolfowitz all repeatedly tried to show that, well, look what we did in El Salvador, look at how successful we are, and look how wonderful the country is today. That's what we can do for Iraq if you just realize that we've got the right idea. Well, that misstates both the history, we weren't successful in El Salvador, and present day. El Salvador is not doing anywhere near as well as they're making out it is. And I felt so compelled by this that I felt I wanted to write a book that described El Salvador as it really is today. And some things are going right. I don't want to paint it as though it's a terrible picture, but so much is going wrong that calling this a victory is just an obscenity. Also, we really didn't achieve victory in El Salvador. Despite $6 billion in aid, despite 10 years of military advisors trying to train that military, the best we ever got was a stalemate. And despite constantly trying to urge them to give up the human rights abuses and the death squads, once they were really threatened in 1989, they reverted and killed 6 Jesuit priests, their housekeeper, and their 16-year-old daughter. That's what brought the war to an end, is that once that military once again reverted, the rest of the world said, we're done with you guys, and washed their hands with them. And we said, look, you've run out of room. You've got to negotiate an end to this. And so they did. The UN actually negotiated the peace. We didn't. The UN did. So to call this a victory, and to call present-day El Salvador, which has the highest homicide rate in the hemisphere, which has a huge gang problem, which has an organized crime problem which operates with impunity, which has an even greater division between rich and poor than it had before the war, and that was the major motivation to the Civil War. When you've got, for example, just recently, 14 protesters were arrested under an anti-terrorism law, and now we're looking at 60 years in prison for protesting, to call this an achievement that we should be proud of is just poisonous. And this is why I felt really, really compelled to write the book. I just thought, no, let's look objectively at what the situation is like. And I wanted Jude to be my protagonist for that because he's extremely apolitical. You've read part of the book, and I know you've probably gotten to the point where he talks about his politics, which is basically a curse on them all, and sanctimonious paranoids on one side, and basically feel-good incompetence on the other. And that's basically the way he looks at politics, and he hates politics. But he finds out that you can't live outside of politics any more than you can live outside of history.
Let's turn to your career as an author. You've written 2 other highly acclaimed novels, Done for a Dime and The Devil's Readhead. When and how did you get your first break in publishing?
My first break in publishing came in late 2000, and unfortunately it was a sad time. My wife was dying of ovarian cancer, and I got the call from my agent in early December that the book had been bought by Ballantine. And I just had a lot of other stuff on my mind at that point, because my wife died on January 8th, 2001. And so it was, in an odd sense, it meant that one chapter of my life was ending, because I'd been a private investigator and I'd been my wife's right-hand man, basically her man Friday in her little law practice, which we used to conduct here at this table. This was like where we had depositions, where we met with clients, and I was going to become a writer, because when she died, the law office was over, because I'm not a lawyer, I'm just an investigator. And that's how that happened. So that was how I basically got the first break, was through Ballantine.
And did you go to other sources before you...
Well, I went to tried to find other agents, and we shopped the book around to some other houses before Ballantine bought it. My acquiring editor was Leona Nevler, who was really one of the great older editors in New York, and I was very proud of that. Unfortunately, because she was older, she also was very highly paid, and in a cost-cutting measure, I think Ballantine decided not to renew her contract, so I lost her as an editor within just a matter of weeks.
Blood of Paradise is one of the first novels published under the new Mortalis imprint at Random House. How did the deal come about?
It was just sort of, I was in the right place at the right time. I'd written a foreign thriller, and Mark Tavani, my editor at Ballantine, had put together a new imprint that was going to specialize in foreign-based thrillers or historical thrillers. And they were going to use it as a way to bring out a new line, as well as bring back some of the stuff from their backlist. For example, Agatha Christie, Gorky Park was going to be reissued in a new paperback format, and that was part of this as well. And I just happened to have a book available at the time that this was going to happen, so it was just fate, luck, whatever.
Your editor at Mortalis is one of our favorite people, Mark Tavani. And your agent is Laurie Fox, also a favorite, whom we often quote in our Authorlink presentations at writers' conferences. How did you meet these people, and how have they helped you on Blood of Paradise?
Well, I met Laurie because of an intermediary, and this man's name is Mike Croft, and he was running the Truckee Meadows Community College Writers' Conference, which sounds very small, and it is, but it was actually a very good conference. And we're sort of a stepsister to the Squaw Valley Writers' Conference, which is much more widely known. And I had met Mike at the Squaw Valley Conference. And he knew I had this book, and I was shopping it around, and he said, I've got a pretty good agent up here that I think you might be interested in meeting. Why don't you, come up and see if she'd be interested. And that's where I met Lori, and she said that, well, I'm personally not taking any new clients, but I'll be happy to read your book, and I'll refer it on to New York, to the main office, if I think it has merit. So I sent her the manuscript, and very delightfully, she called me back and said, you didn't tell me you were this good, and this is a great book, and I'm just thrilled. I would like to represent you myself. And so I said, that works for me. And she began shopping it around, and like I said, it landed at Ballantine with Leona Nevler. But then Leona was let go, and I got a second editor who shall remain nameless. I learned subsequently from another agent that this particular editor was somewhat roundly considered the worst editor in the history of New York. But she did actually do a couple things for me. In particular, she fought for a new cover for Devil's Readhead. The cover the art department came up with was not something we felt would work, to put it bluntly. And I got the image that ultimately became the cover for Devil's Readhead, which is a cover I'm very fond of. So she did that, but just as the hardcover was coming out of the warehouse, I got a call from my new editor, which was Mark Tavani. And Leona, my first editor, said, well, this is who you should have had all along. That second editor made no sense for you. And I've been thrilled. I think Mark's a great editor, and I think he's going to be a real force in the literary world for quite a while.
Has there ever been a time when you felt you wanted to quit writing? If so, describe that feeling and tell us what you did to regain that inspiration.
I don't know that I ever felt that I wanted to quit writing. The Blood of Paradise was a difficult book to write, and I remember that I had to rewrite the beginning. And one of the problems of basing a book on a Greek drama is that Greek dramas have tons of backstory that you don't have to talk about because everybody knew it. These are like tales that everybody knew. They were part of Greek culture. So you could always kind of start in the middle and everybody got it. Well, I couldn't do that since I was translating it to a new time, and none of my readers were going to know the personal backstory of these three characters. And trying to finesse that in the front, where you didn't feel like you were just getting hammered with backstory, which would cause people to fall asleep, was really a huge problem. I remember at one point almost wanting to weep because I just couldn't get it right. But I think I ultimately finished it well enough. But in general, I can't say that I've ever really wanted to stop writing. In fact, one of the jokes my writer buddies and I talk about is that I'd quit writing if I knew how. It's just in your blood or it's not, and it's in my blood, regrettably. And so I don't feel right if I'm not working on something. If I'm not writing a book, I feel adrift. It's how I make sense of my world.
What is the best thing for you about being a successful novelist?
The best thing about being, I think successful is a nice term. I appreciate you're saying it. One of the nice things about being a published author is that somebody really is waiting for a book, and that my work has an audience. And so it's that sense of, will this ever matter, is gone. And more, is this good enough, is the question. And I prefer that. And I'm a bit of a perfectionist, so I don't mind that challenge.
What words of advice do you have for writers who are still struggling to break into publishing?
Never give up. If you know it's what you want to do, if you know that this is how you make sense of the world, this is how you express yourself, if this is your medium for facing the world or whatever, it's almost a spiritual thing. I was just reading Orwell's Why I Write, and he tried to give up writing in his early 20s, and he just said, but it just made him wretched. It made him feel that he had betrayed a very core part of himself. That's a real key thing. If you find you give up writing, you just feel awful, that that life doesn't make any sense, or that you feel like you've given up your dream. You're a writer, and that means to stick with it. Constantly try to improve your craft, and try to get into situations where you can meet agents, show them your work, maybe have a writers group with other writers you respect. So that combination of don't give up and constantly trying to find an audience one way or another, I think those are the two things that are most important.
Okay, David Corbett, thanks so much for being with us today.
And you're welcome. Thank you for coming out to my house.